Have you ever felt surrounded by enemies? Perhaps not literal armies encamped around your home, but that sense that forces beyond your control were conspiring against you? That feeling of being overwhelmed, outnumbered, and desperate for divine intervention? In the year 841 BCE, a coalition of enemy nations surrounded the small kingdom of Judah. The situation was dire. 10 powerful neighboring kingdoms had formed an unprecedented alliance with one deadly purpose: to erase the nation of Israel from existence. "Come," they said, "let us destroy them as a nation, so that Israel's name is remembered no more." This wasn't hypothetical. This wasn't paranoia. This was a nation facing existential threat. How did they respond? With one of the most passionate pleas for divine justice found in the ancient scriptures, Psalm 83. What makes this psalm so remarkable isn't just its historical context, but how it speaks to anyone who has ever faced overwhelming opposition. The psalmist doesn't whisper polite prayers. He cries out for cosmic intervention against injustice. Today, we're exploring this ancient prayer of desperation, its historical context, and what it teaches us about facing seemingly impossible odds. Because sometimes, silence is not an option. The Book of Psalms contains 150 songs and prayers covering the full spectrum of human emotion, from exultant praise to the darkest lamentations. Among these ancient texts, Psalm 83 stands out as what scholars call an imprecatory psalm, a psalm that invokes judgment or curses upon enemies. Many modern readers struggle with these psalms. They seem harsh, vindictive, even contrary to teachings about loving our enemies. But understanding the historical context helps us grasp why such desperate language was used. Psalm 83 is attributed to Asaph, though it was likely written by one of his descendants who served as temple musicians and prophets long after the original Asaph's time. The superscription simply reads, a song, a psalm of Asaph. Let's read the psalm in its entirety before exploring its background and meaning. O God, do not remain silent. Do not turn a deaf ear. Do not stand aloof, O God. See how your enemies growl, how your foes rear their heads. With cunning they conspire against your people. They plot against those you cherish. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation, so that Israel's name is remembered no more. With one mind they plot together. They form an alliance against you, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagrites, Byblos, Ammon and Amalek, Philistia, with the people of Tyre. Even Assyria has joined them to reinforce Lot's descendants. Do to them as you did to Midian, as you did to Sisera and Jabin at the river Kishon, who perished at Endor and became like dung on the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us take possession of the pasture lands of God. Make them like tumbleweed, my God, like chaff before the wind. As fire consumes the forest or a flame sets the mountains ablaze, so pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your storm. Cover their faces with shame, Lord, so that they will seek your name. May they ever be ashamed and dismayed. May they perish in disgrace. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, that you alone are the most high over all the earth. The enemies listed in Psalm 83 form a ring around Israel. To the south, we have Edom, descendants of Esau, who had a long-standing rivalry with Israel dating back to Jacob and Esau's conflict. To the east, we have Moab and Ammon, descendants of Lot, with whom Israel had complex relations throughout history. The Ishmaelites, Hagrites, and Amalekites were desert nomadic peoples who frequently raided Israelite territory. To the west, we find the Philistines, Israel's perpetual enemies who controlled much of the coastal regions. To the north was Tyre, a powerful Phoenician city-state. And finally, the mention of Assyria, the emerging superpower of the day, shows the gravity of this alliance. This wasn't just local tribal warfare. This was an existential threat coordinated across multiple kingdoms. Many scholars believe this psalm refers to specific historical events, with three main possibilities. First, it could describe the alliance that attacked Judah during King Jehoshaphat's reign around 850 BCE, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 20. The Bible tells us that the Moabites and Ammonites, together with some Meunites, came to wage war against Jehoshaphat. Second, it might refer to the crisis during King Uzziah's reign in the 8th century BCE, when multiple neighbors threatened Judah. Third, and perhaps most likely, it could describe the events preceding the Assyrian conquest in the late 8th century BCE, when Israel faced threats from all directions. Regardless of the exact historical setting, the psalm clearly emerges from a time when Israel faced overwhelming odds against a coordinated conspiracy of enemies intent on their complete destruction. Place yourself in ancient Jerusalem for a moment. The temple stands majestic on Mount Zion. Smoke rises from sacrifices. The sounds of ritual worship fill the air. But beyond the city walls, reports arrive daily of armies mobilizing, of kingdoms historically at odds with each other now forming unprecedented alliances. Spies and messengers bring word that these nations aren't simply planning to conquer or subjugate Israel. Their goal is complete annihilation, to wipe out Israel as a nation, so that its name will be remembered no more. This is the setting in which this psalm was composed and recited. It wasn't written in comfortable safety, but in desperate national crisis. The psalm begins with an urgent plea, "O God, do not remain silent." This is no formal religious ritual, it's a desperate cry. The psalmist perceives God's silence as indifference. Do not turn a deaf ear, do not stand aloof. There's an immediacy here. The threat isn't theoretical or future, it's present and pressing. The enemies are described as growling and rearing their heads, animal imagery suggesting predators preparing to strike. The conspiracy is characterized by both cunning and unity. These nations, often at odds with each other throughout history, have found common cause in their hatred of Israel. The term used for conspire in the original Hebrew is sod, which indicates a council or secret assembly. This isn't random aggression but calculated, coordinated strategy. In verses 9 to 12, the psalmist recalls previous divine interventions in Israel's history. These weren't just random examples, but specifically chosen precedents of God delivering Israel from overwhelming odds. The defeat of Midian refers to Gideon's victory recorded in Judges 7, where a vastly outnumbered Israelite force triumphed through divine intervention. Sisera and Jabin were Canaanite military leaders defeated by Deborah and Barak, as told in Judges 4-5. At the river Kishon, natural elements, likely a flash flood, helped defeat Sisera's technologically superior forces with their 900 iron chariots. Oreb, Zeb, Zebah, and Zalmunna were Midianite kings defeated by Gideon's forces. Their defeat was total and humiliating. Each reference reminds both God and the worshiping community of previous deliverances, establishing precedent for divine intervention. This rhetorical strategy is common in ancient Near Eastern prayers, reminding the deity of past actions as grounds for present intervention. The imprecations or curses that follow in verses 13 to 17 are shocking to modern ears. The psalmist asks God to make the enemies like tumbleweed, like chaff before the wind, to pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your storm. These aren't expressions of personal vengeance, but appeals to divine justice. The psalm emerged from a theocratic worldview where God was understood as both sovereign and just, responsible for establishing right order in the world. Importantly, the ultimate purpose stated isn't merely destruction but recognition. Cover their faces with shame, Lord, so that they will seek your name. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, that you alone are the most high over all the earth. Even in its call for judgment, the psalm envisions enemies coming to recognize God's sovereignty. The final verse shifts from imprecation to recognition of divine sovereignty. The ultimate purpose is God's glory and recognition, not merely enemy destruction. The imagery used in the psalm draws heavily from nature: tumbleweed driven by wind, chaff scattered, forest fires, mountain blazes, storms and tempests. These natural forces embody both divine power and the transience of human opposition against God. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, control over nature was the ultimate sign of divine power. By invoking these natural forces, the psalmist appeals to God's sovereign power over creation itself. One fascinating aspect of Psalm 83 is how it portrays the attack on Israel as ultimately an attack on God himself. In verse 5, the psalmist states that these nations form an alliance against you. This wasn't merely geopolitical conflict but spiritual warfare. This theological interpretation of political events reflects the covenant relationship between God and Israel. As God's chosen people, an attack on Israel was perceived as an attack on God's plans and purposes. This doesn't imply that every political action of Israel was divinely sanctioned, but rather that the attempted annihilation of the nation opposed God's covenant promises. The historical reality of small nations in the ancient Near East was precarious. Located at the crossroads of empires, Egypt to the south, Mesopotamian powers to the northeast, Hittites and others to the north, the land of Israel was constantly vulnerable to larger powers. Without divine protection, human calculations would predict their inevitable conquest and assimilation. Yet Israel's continued existence despite overwhelming odds became a testimony to divine preservation. As Moses had told the people centuries earlier, "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples." Deuteronomy 7 verse 7. The geopolitical situation described in Psalm 83 highlights this vulnerability. Surrounded by hostile powers forming an unprecedented coalition, Israel's natural strategic position was hopeless. Their appeal was therefore not to military strength but to divine intervention. The psalm also reveals the integrated worldview of ancient Israel, where political, military, and spiritual realities weren't separate spheres but interconnected expressions of a unified reality under God's sovereignty. Modern Western thinking tends to compartmentalize politics, religion, and natural forces as separate domains. For the ancient psalmist, all were under divine authority. Military threats had spiritual dimensions. Natural disasters could be instruments of divine judgment. Political alliances could oppose divine purposes. Throughout history, Psalm 83 has spoken powerfully to communities facing persecution and existential threat. During the Maccabean revolt against Seleucid oppression in the 2nd century BCE, Jews found resonance in its description of conspiring nations seeking Israel's destruction. Early Christians facing Roman persecution found in the psalm expression for their experience of being surrounded by hostile powers. During the Holocaust, Jewish communities turned to Psalm 83 as they faced Nazi Germany's explicit goal to eradicate Jewish existence, a modern manifestation of the ancient threat to ensure Israel's name is remembered no more. And in various religious persecutions throughout history, minority faith communities have found in this psalm authentic expression of their experience and hope for divine justice. But how do we apply this ancient imprecatory psalm today, particularly in light of Jesus' teaching to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us? First, we must recognize that Psalm 83 gives voice to authentic human emotions in the face of injustice. The Bible doesn't censor the raw human cry for justice. When we experience or witness overwhelming injustice, the psalm gives us language to express our outrage before God rather than taking matters into our own hands. Second, the psalm ultimately entrusts justice to God rather than pursuing personal vengeance. This aligns with New Testament teaching: "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." Romans 12 verse 19. Third, the psalm reminds us that evil must be confronted, not ignored. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German theologian who resisted the Nazi regime, wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." The psalm's most challenging aspect remains its imprecatory language asking for divine judgment on enemies. How do we reconcile this with Jesus' command to love our enemies? Theologians have proposed several approaches. Some see these psalms as recording human emotions rather than prescribing proper attitudes, documenting authentic human reactions without necessarily endorsing them. Others view them as expressions of justice against systems of evil rather than against individuals. The psalm targets oppressive powers and systems rather than individual persons. Still, others note that by entrusting vengeance to God, the psalm actually restrains human vigilante justice. Rather than taking revenge personally, the psalmist entrusts judgment to divine wisdom. Finally, many note that the Psalm's ultimate goal isn't enemy destruction but recognition of divine sovereignty. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, that you alone are the most high over all the earth. The purpose is revelatory, that all would recognize God's authority. For ancient Israelites gathered in the temple courts, reciting this psalm in corporate worship served multiple purposes. It provided language for national lament and crisis, acknowledging the reality of threat without descending into despair. It placed current events within the larger story of God's faithfulness, connecting present crisis to past deliverances. It transferred the burden of national defense from human shoulders to divine hands, reducing anxiety by entrusting the nation's fate to God. It unified the community around shared faith in crisis, strengthening social bonds when they were most needed. And it transformed fear into hope by framing current threats within a larger theological narrative where God's purposes ultimately prevail. The geographical reality of ancient Israel's vulnerability remains visible in modern Israel. Standing in Jerusalem, you can see how this small territory was constantly vulnerable to surrounding powers. The scale of ancient kingdoms may have changed, but the geopolitical challenges of the region continue to echo ancient patterns. This continuity reminds us that Psalm 83 wasn't addressing abstract or theoretical concerns, but concrete historical realities faced by real communities in actual geopolitical crisis. What's remarkable is how the psalm transforms geopolitical crisis into theological proclamation. Rather than ending in despair at overwhelming odds, it concludes with confident assertion of divine sovereignty. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord,